So just a reminder, we're looking at Galatians chapter 5, and particularly we're looking at verses 22 and 23. This is what they read, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And we're just spending a few weeks looking at each of those ideas around the fruit of the Spirit, each of the markers of the fruit of the Spirit, the way in which the fruit of the Spirit works. We're looking this afternoon at faithfulness. I didn't know that Dan was going to sing and it was his last Sunday and all of that kind of thing, but it just really reminded me that life is full of little moments that seem completely insignificant. And yet when we, in our lives, piece together those little moments, we end up in a place which is surprising to us. We don't expect very often to be where we are. I remember you'll have heard me speak often about a preacher from New York City called Tim Keller. Tim Keller recounts a story how through incredible and complex ways, he ended up being taught by a professor that encouraged him to go and start a church in New York, who had ended up teaching in seminary because of a strange set of events around Watergate, the scandal around Nixon, the president. Those of you who don't know about Watergate, you're incredibly young. Go and check it out on Wikipedia. But Keller's idea is this professor would not have been teaching in that seminary if it hadn't been for Watergate. Watergate wouldn't have happened if somebody hadn't left one door unlatched and a security guard went in. If you piece together all of those little events in life, you end up ultimately with a church in Manhattan which has blessed millions of people around the world. You and I are here today through a strange and surprising set of events. The last thing I expected to be doing as I was growing up was, number one, living in Yorkshire. That was a surprise. Number two, being in this place. That was a surprise. Number three, being here today with you. That was not on my agenda. And I suspect being here for some of you wasn't on your agenda. Our text this afternoon gives us a little insight into a surprising set of events that places Jesus with one particular person, a woman, a Samaritan woman. But I think what it also does is it teaches us about faithfulness. It gives us an insight into what faithfulness is. What faithfulness means when we come to this particular piece of the Bible, which talks about all of the ways in which the work of the Spirit can be seen and the manifestations of the fruit and faithfulness appears in that list. Faithfulness is surprising in that list. I think as more I've kind of thought about it and dug into it, the more it is almost the engine for everything else, is faithfulness. What is faithfulness? Our first, excuse me, is anybody drunk out of that? No, I'll take one off my wife. That's safer, isn't it? Yeah, there we go. There we go, that's definitely better. It's a pair of false teeth in the bottom of that one anyway. Right. Faithfulness, when we think about faithfulness and its place in this particular list, faithfulness is surprising. We think of faithfulness and we read it in the Bible, and immediately we think of faithfulness as Christian faith. But in actual fact, I think the characteristic of faithfulness that is talked about in this particular list, it is Christian faith, but it doesn't have to be Christian faith. in the way that it's used. What is faithfulness? What is the definition of faithfulness? Faithfulness is the idea of being a consistent, well, in mathematical terms, those of you who are mathematical geniuses, there is a mathematical idea in geometry called faithful representation, where one set of data is a faithful representation of another set of data. It is absolutely consistent. That is consistent with that. We can talk about a faithful copy. One of the programs that I do tend to geek out on every now and then is Fake or Fortune, where they look at pieces of art and try to detect whether it's a genuine master or whether it's a kind of a fake copy. One of the things that I've learned is that titanium white only appeared in the 20th century. So if the characteristics of titanium white appear in a picture by Rembrandt, it's a copy. It's not a faithful representation. It's not consistent. So the idea that we see, I think, in the word used here, faithfulness, is about genuine consistency. We can be faithful to things that are terrible. We can be faithful to things that are insignificant. Any of you are around in the kind of 80s or into Northern Seoul, you'll have seen badges with the fist and keep the faith. Keep sticking with it. We can be faithful to something. What we see here is the writer, Paul, is trying to encourage us to think about faithfulness as consistency. Can I be consistent? And so, if you think then about how faithfulness starts to impact on all of the others, can I be faithfully loving? Can I be faithfully joyful? Can I be faithfully representative of peace? Can I be faithfully self-controlled? Will I be consistently self-controlled? There is a sense in which faithfulness here works to create a consistency of all of the others. It's a really important thing in the way that we read that word faithfulness. Because faithfulness we just gloss over and we think Christian faith. What is it? Consistency in what we see around us, that work of the Holy Spirit. So let's have a look at the text. It's an interesting text. And it's one of those moments that it really is the most surprising of encounters. And we're not going to cover all of the story. Just want to cover the first little bit. We've got Jesus, who is leaving Judea, traveling back to Galilee because of challenges with the Pharisees. And as he's passing by through Samaria, kind of politically important, Jesus is leaving his people, the Jews, and entering into Samaria, the Samaritans, who are at loggerheads. They're in conflict with each other. During the time of Jesus, that conflict would be at times just antagonism. At times it would break into sort of street brawls and all of that kind of thing, but always constantly suppressed in both Judea and Samaria and by the Roman authorities. There was kind of this cap over the Jews and the Samaritans, but it would break out with antagonism. They religiously, culturally hated each other. They would have nothing to do with each other. And Jesus is traveling through Samaria. And there's a fleeting moment where Jesus goes to a well, which is biblically interesting, but not critical to the story. It's just a well that refers to the work of Jacob, some of the Old Testament stuff. In the middle of the day, he encounters a woman who's collecting water. She is alone. But strikingly, we can see it in verse 8, Jesus is also alone. He's traveling back to Galilee with his disciples, but his disciples had gone into the town to buy water. The woman recognized Jesus straight away as being a Jew. In that moment, in that very moment, there would have been an expectation, an assumption that either she needed to be cautious because this could be particularly awful for her, or the best outcome was that there would be silence. She could collect some water. They don't make eye contact. She could collect the water and just go. That would be the best outcome for this woman as far as she was concerned. By herself at the well with a Jewish man who has appeared at the well also. She wouldn't comment. And yet Jesus does. What breaks out is a kind of surprising and scandalous kind of conversation. Look at verse 7. Jesus says to her, "Will you give me a drink?" Seems so nothing to us, doesn't it? It was absolute cultural dynamite. It was outrageous that Jesus would even speak to her, that Jesus would engage with her. And counter to what she expected, he didn't abuse her and spit on her. He engaged with her in a relational context. It sounds, doesn't it, as though Jesus is kind of playing that patriarchal, hierarchical thing. That's how we read it with 21st century eyes. Can you serve me? Actually, what Jesus in cultural terms was doing was reaching out relationally and saying, will you drink with me? Will you be with me? Will you engage with me? I think that's, if we want to understand what faithfulness is, there's the first little insight as to the way Jesus was. He speaks to the woman consistently with the way that he's spoken to everybody that he's ever engaged with. Then there's this strange and confusing conversation that goes on with waters. Verse 7, when a Samaritan woman came to draw water, will you give me a drink? And then she says, really? You want me to give you a drink? And Jesus replies, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. He would have given you living water. What's that all about? The woman is confused. She just doesn't get it. You haven't got anything to go and draw water. And I know, I come here regularly. I know that water down there is normal water. There's nothing special about that water. So it seems to me, number one, you haven't got anything to draw water with. And secondly, are you some sort of Jacob reinvented who can find a way to get us water from somewhere else when you can't even draw it anyway? What do you mean? What are you talking about? The idea that you can give me living water. That little encounter, that little moment, if we unpick it, if we find out what's going on, if we understand, speaks so incredibly powerfully about the nature of faithfulness that we see in Jesus. It reveals for us the true heart of Jesus. Here's the thing. The woman could have come and gone to the well, and nobody would have known. Jesus could have gone to the well, seen the woman. None of his disciples were around. They'd disappeared. She could have passed by and gone, and nobody would have known. Nobody would have had any inclination. And there we see the first narrowing of the lens that starts to point to what faithfulness is. Because faithfulness, as we see it laid out, I think, and the way this word faithfulness works, and the way we've talked about consistency, is here's the question: is Jesus, and therefore is God, consistent? Is he going to be seen when no one else is looking? Is he going to be seen to be consistent dealing with this outcast Samaritan woman as he was dealing with those that are his inner clan? Is he going to be consistent when there's nobody to look at him, as when there are people who can see around him, see him around? Is he going to be like that? What kind of God have we got? Is it a God who is consistent and faithful when it's not seen? And yet what we see in this is the most remarkable of things. At a time when Jesus could have let a woman appear and disappear, he reaches out to her with the same love, engagement, faithfulness, goodness, mercy, as if he was surrounded by the multitudes of people that he is normally surrounded by. That's what he is like. That's how he engages. He's the same when it's just a Samaritan woman and nobody else, as he is when there's thousands around him. Consistent faithfulness. And that speaks a little bit into how we started, isn't it? Think that woman expected anything that morning when she picked up her jar to go and collect water? Did she expect that day was going to be a day that turned her life and her eternity around? Did she expect that there would be, at that moment, an engagement with the Creator of heaven and earth that changed everything for her? And it would never have happened, her life would never have been turned around if Jesus had not been faithful, if he had not been consistent to who he is and to his mission, even when nobody was there to watch him. Isn't that amazing? Whatever the events that have brought you here, whatever the journey of your faith, maybe you've lived a life of faith for decades. Maybe you're at the beginning of the journey of a life of faith. Maybe you're considering this, or maybe you're here just in a moment, surprisingly here. Here's the reality, as far as I can see it, when we have that moment, when the Bible is being spoken about, we have a moment where the truth of God is being engaged with us. It's a potential turning point. What brought us here, and yet we find the faithfulness of God is speaking to us through his word even now. Jesus embodies that consistency. What we see, I think, as well, though, when we start to see what faithfulness is like in Jesus, we then come back to our text, which says that kind of consistency, that kind of faithful representation is what you and I, if we are believers in Jesus, are called to do. And I think when we get to that, I start to describe it more like impossible faithfulness. See, what we see in Jesus is the kind of faithfulness that it's... Can we maintain that? Can we be faithful like that? If we've seen what faithfulness looks like in every situation, consistently exhibiting love, kindness, goodness, gentleness, not when everybody's watching, but maybe when it's just one-on-one. What about when it's just one other person who maybe I'm really not keen on, don't like, all that kind of stuff? Am I going to continue to exhibit that kind of nature? Can I do that? That starts to feel to me like impossible faithfulness, to be honest. Let's go a little bit further. Because I think we could push it just another step further. And we could say the essence of you and me is what we are alone. What we are in our solitude is the true nature of you and me. What we are inside of our minds is the true us, isn't it? I don't know about you, but I'll put myself up there and say, this is how I think it works. The right circles, the right set of people around us, we all put a mask on. And the mask can look great. And then we end up with those who are really close to us. And the mask slips a little bit because we're in a safe place and we think that the mask doesn't have to quite be what it should be. And then we get alone in our own thoughts, and then the mask can completely disappear. And I look into the metaphoric mirror and I see myself in the true essence of myself. And I look at the kind of faithfulness that Galatians chapter 5, 22 and 23 calls me to, and I say that kind of consistency and faithfulness in my solitude becomes even more impossible. Can Jesus maintain that kind of faithfulness in his solitude? Because after all, there is at least a Samaritan woman to see him here. What about when he's truly alone? Is he faithful then? Is he displaying the kind of faithfulness you and I need and at the same cannot maintain? There's a little insight, I think. Well, I don't think, I know there's an insight in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 39, when we see Jesus alone, totally alone, in fact, even more alone than you could ever imagine, because what we see is the beginnings of the stretching and breaking of the connection between the Father and the Son when he goes into a garden and he faces the next day and he goes a little further and he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." See, that last little bit reveals the consistency of Jesus, doesn't it? That right at that moment, you and I would not be here if that second sentence didn't exist. We would not have the hope of salvation if he had prayed, "Take this cup from my lips, let me come and be with you again." We would not be here. But because Jesus prayed, not my will but yours be done, we are here. Because Jesus was faithful in his solitude at a deeper level than he was faithful one-on-one, in a deeper level than he was faithful to a multitude. When it really came down to it, we see in Jesus a faithfulness to his Father and a consistency which reveals to you and me, in my solitude, I know I cannot maintain the faithfulness that Galatians chapter 5 calls me to. I can't do it. And I know you can't do it as well. You can't. I can't. We cannot maintain that kind of stripped solitude by ourselves, faithfulness to God. And yet, here's the thing. This is not the fruit of being a Christian. This is not how it is. This is not the fruit of being a Christian. This is the fruit of the Spirit. It's the Spirit that is the defining factor in this list of characteristics that is what it is to believe in Jesus. That it says, you will be faithful because it is the Spirit. And here's the amazing thing. The very conversation that Jesus has with this woman is the promise of the Spirit. Verse 10 and 11. If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. Sir, I don't know what that water is. The dimension is the living water is the kind of water that if you drink it, you are never thirsty again. It satisfies you eternally. It's the kind of spiritual thirst that you've got, that I've got, that we know that we need something, and we step into it and we say, I can't maintain the satisfaction, and the Spirit of God says, I know, but I can in you. That's what the Spirit does. That's what it means for you and me, at maybe wherever we are on our journey, to engage with Jesus in the way this Samaritan woman did, and actually be able to say, perhaps I can trust this Jesus to sustain me so that I can be more faithful, more consistent in representing Jesus than I ever could have dreamt of in my own strength. That is what faithfulness, working by the power of the Holy Spirit, does within us. Effective hope.